Something began to change in the streets of South Los Angeles. This time, it wasn't the usual back and forth of neighborhood gang rivalries. For years, Florencia 13 and the East Coast Crips had managed to keep tensions from escalating into an all-out war. But that fragile balance collapsed when a quiet command came down from inside Pelican Bay. The order was simple but devastating: cleanse the neighborhood. What followed wasn't chaotic or random, it was methodical, deliberate, and intended to send a clear message. The conflict stopped being about colors or street pride. It had evolved into a battle over power, control, and survival. What began with a few targeted killings soon spiraled into something far darker: the rise of the East Side Crips. To understand how this all unfolded, we have to rewind to the late 1960s. In 1969, a young man named Raymond Washington laid the foundation for what became the original East Side Crips. Before creating his own crew, Washington had been affiliated with the Avenues, a group led by Craig Monson. But after tensions erupted during a dispute in Donny Boy's garage, Washington was pushed out of the circle. That setback didn't stop him, it pushed him to start something of his own. Around that time, his mother was living near 76th Street and Wadsworth, and that neighborhood soon became the nucleus of what grew into the East Side movement. By 1970, Washington's crew was beginning to gain momentum, establishing a presence across the east side of Los Angeles. Within a year, new sets were forming, including the 43rd Street Crips and Avalon Gardens Crips. Each adopted the identity and strength of the Crip movement, paving the way for what would soon become the East Coast Crips. The East Coast Crips Alliance. The East Coast Crips weren't a single gang but rather a coalition, an alliance of multiple sets united under a common banner. By 1974, the East Side 62nd Street Crips helped spark what became known as the East Coast Crips Alliance. It's important to note that many of the groups that later identified as East Coast Crips had already existed under other names since the early 1970s. Crews like the Q102, Town Street Boys, 69 Shack Boys, 76 Shack Boys, and the 118 Block were already operating before officially adopting the East Coast identity. The 62nd Street set may have been one of the first to officially use East Coast in its name during the late 1970s, but they weren't necessarily the oldest. Most East Coast sets fall under larger umbrellas, such as the Neighborhood Crips or the Block Crips. Many ride under the 2X card, which connects them to the Neighborhood Crips. When these sets align, they're often referred to as the East Coast Neighborhood Crips. A deeper web. This network of alliances shows how the Crip structure in Los Angeles wasn't just about individual neighborhoods, it was about interconnected webs of power. What began as local crews quickly evolved into a citywide force, shaping the landscape of gang culture for decades to come. The story of the East Coast Crips is more than just turf battles, it's about how fractured groups merged, rebranded, and organized under broader umbrellas of identity. It's about survival in a city where the stakes kept climbing, and where every order from inside a prison cell could shift the balance of power on the streets. Shifting alliances and old rivalries. The East Coast Crips have long rolled alongside the Rolling O sets of the Crip network, crews like the Rolling 90s, Rolling 60s, and Rolling 40s Neighborhood Crips. But alliances in Los Angeles gang culture rarely meant lasting peace. The East Coast Crips were locked in bitter rivalries with sets tied to the Gangster Crips under the 3X card, and they maintained a decades-long war with Florencia 13, one of the largest Mexican-American street gangs in the city. For a time, though, East Coast Crips and Florencia 13 kept their distance. During the turbulent late 1980s and early 1990s, when most Black and Latino gangs clashed regularly, these two groups largely stayed out of each other's way. Each was preoccupied with conflicts inside their own racial lines. But that balance didn't last. The Mexican Mafia's influence. By the mid-1990s, the Mexican Mafia, known inside as La Rime, began exerting stronger control over Latino gangs across Los Angeles. Orders came down to stop fighting each other and instead focus on extorting drug dealers, consolidating power, and pushing black gangs out of traditional Latino strongholds. Florencia 13 had long been at odds with another Latino crew, 38th Street. But under the new rules, they were told to make peace. In a symbolic moment, members of both gangs even played a pick-up football game to smooth over hostilities. Yet peace was fragile, and the fragile truce was soon broken. The spark that lit the fuse. In 1996, tensions boiled over when members of the 65 Hustlers, affiliated with the East Coast Crips, killed a Florencia member. Retaliation followed quickly, sparking a cycle of violence. A peace summit was even attempted at Palm Elementary School, but the ceasefire collapsed almost as soon as it began. By the late 1990s, Florencia 13 was at war with nearly every East Coast Crip set on the east side of South Los Angeles. One key trigger came when a driver linked to the 68 or 69 East Coast Crips was entrusted with transporting a Florencia drug shipment of up to 300 kilos. Instead of delivering it, he allegedly kept it with associates from the six-pack set. That betrayal escalated the conflict into a full-blown war. Castellanos' iron grip. Even from behind bars, Florencia 13's leadership remained strong. Luis Castellanos, locked in Pelican Bay's notorious SHU since 1990, ran operations like a general in exile. He sent out handwritten kites, tiny smuggled notes, that laid out detailed rules for the gang. Every Florencia set was required to have a president and vice president, hold weekly meetings, and settle internal disputes through one-on-one fights overseen by leadership. Once a conflict was resolved, it couldn't be reopened. Paperwork checks were mandatory for anyone coming home from prison, ensuring no informants or defectors slipped back in. Members were expected to clean house if they discovered otherwise. The dope trade was also tightly controlled. Heroin could be sold in county jail if necessary, but methamphetamine, crank, or crystal were forbidden. On the streets, heroin sales were banned within their own neighborhoods to avoid unwanted attention. Ties to the Mexican mafia gave Florencia protection from being taxed or greenlit by other Latino gangs, and Castellanos himself often bragged that his leadership shielded his barrio from outside threats. Orders of violence. Castellanos appointed trusted lieutenants as shot callers to manage the streets, overseeing drug sales, collecting extortion taxes, and keeping sets in line. But one order stood out above all: remove black gangs from Florence Firestone, with the East Coast Crips being the prime target because they threatened Florencia's drug profits. Sets like the Joker's Clique, one of the oldest and most connected Florencia crews, carried out this directive ruthlessly. If they couldn't find a rival gang member, they targeted any black person in the area, treating them as enemies by default. A deadly example. The violence reached a chilling point on October 11, 2004. That evening, Emmanuel Romero drove a stolen car to pick up fellow Florencia members Mario Moreno and Edgar Navarro. As soon as Moreno got inside, he flashed a rifle and made it clear what their mission was. They were headed to put in work. Their destination was a liquor store deep in territory claimed by the 89 East Coast Crips. Outside the store, two black men, Robert Tyrone King and Darrell Dennard, were simply hanging out with beers in hand. Neither man was gang affiliated. But that didn't matter. Moreno leaned out of the car window and opened fire, striking both men in the back. Dennard later died from his wounds, while King survived. The shooting showed just how far the conflict had spiraled. What began as a turf dispute over drugs had transformed into open racial warfare, turning neighborhoods into battlegrounds and putting innocent lives at risk. Heavy sentences and escalating violence. Emmanuel Romero and Mario Moreno both faced serious charges after the liquor store shooting. Prosecutors hit them with murder, attempted murder, and a series of gang and firearm enhancements. Moreno's case was separated, but Emmanuel went to trial. The jury didn't hesitate. He was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder, with every possible gang and gun enhancement stacked on top. The judge delivered one of the harshest sentences imaginable: 25 years to life for the murder, another 25 to life for discharging a firearm, 15 to life for the attempted murder, and an additional 25 to life for the firearm enhancement. Put together, it was essentially a life sentence without hope of release. But while the courtroom dust was settling, violence in the streets was far from over. The shooting on 66th Street. On the afternoon of April 15, 2005, Colleen Enriquez was sitting on her front porch when trouble sparked. A group of Latino men, including Y.A. Oliva, began shouting racial slurs at a passing black man, throwing up gang signs and even using the N-word. The man flashed a couple of signs back before walking down towards 66th Street. Colleen recognized the Latino men immediately. They were from Florencia 13, a dominant presence in the neighborhood. But the black man was unfamiliar to her. About 15 to 20 minutes later, she saw him return, this time accompanied by Stephen Patterson, a face she knew well from around 66th Street. Feeling uneasy, Colleen and her mother, Esther Gonzalez, went inside and watched from behind their blinds. From their vantage point, they could clearly see Patterson's face. Moments later, the conflict erupted. Patterson and the other man pulled out guns and opened fire on the Latino group. Colleen counted about 5 shots. Oliva collapsed instantly, struck in the face. Patterson and his companion fled back towards 66th Street. Colleen didn't hesitate to tell police what she saw. She identified Patterson as one of the shooters, pointed out his house, and later confirmed her testimony in both photo lineups and court. Conflicting accounts. Esther Gonzalez, Colleen's mother, offered a slightly different version. She said she saw 2 black men exchange gang signs with a group of 6 Latino men before walking away. Roughly 20 minutes later, the same 2 men returned and opened fire. She couldn't name the shooters, but remembered one had tightly braided hair. Esther also mentioned graffiti outside their home. Florencia 13 tags had long been on the wall, but earlier that same day someone had crossed them out in red spray paint. She didn't know who was behind either marking, but it symbolized the turf war being fought on her block. Witness testimonies. Another witness, Juan Sedano, admitted his memory was clouded because he had been mixing alcohol and pills that day. He recalled being with Oliva, hearing about 4 gunshots, and seeing Oliva fall. He denied arguing with black men but acknowledged his ties to Florencia 13. Detective Brian Steinwand, who interviewed Sedano the same day, disputed Sedano's claim of being intoxicated. He testified that Sedano appeared clear-headed and told him a more detailed story. According to that version, Sedano and Oliva saw a black man with cornrows flashing gang signs. They responded with insults and gestures before stepping around to the back of the building. When Sedano returned to the front, he crossed the street to a friend's place, went inside, and then heard gunfire erupt. Detective Martinez later took the stand to give the broader context. He explained that the area was a hotbed of conflict, claimed by both Florencia 13 and the 66th Street clique of the East Coast Crips. He used photos of the graffiti to map out the ongoing territorial struggle, not only between Florencia and the East Coast Crips but also involving another rival crew, the Southside Hustler Crips. This incident revealed how fragile the balance was in South Los Angeles. Courtrooms handed down life sentences, but on the streets, neighborhood wars kept grinding forward, pulling in both gang members and bystanders who just happened to live in the crossfire. Tattoos, alibis, and a conviction. Normally, Crip sets backed each other up, but the graffiti on the walls told a different story. It signaled conflict, not unity. Investigators also examined Stephen Patterson's tattoos, 2-6, 166% East, and several hand markings resembling 6s. He also had a double H tattoo, identical to Southside Hustler Crips graffiti in the area, suggesting a possible connection. Yet, Detective Martinez testified he had spent 7 years working gangs in that neighborhood and had never once seen Patterson's name in police files. When Patterson's case went to trial, his grandfather, Y.C. Pryor, stepped forward to provide an alibi. He insisted Patterson had been at home with him the entire time. A neighbor across the street, Carla Chaikin, supported this claim. She testified that she heard gunshots, looked outside, and saw both Patterson and his grandfather stepping out of their home just seconds afterward. Another witness, Trinidad Lever, who worked nearby at Edison High School, also cast doubt on the prosecution's version. He admitted hearing the shots and then seeing 2 black men running. But he was adamant, neither was Stephen Patterson. He said the men stopped briefly at a house, spoke to someone, then took off toward some apartments. Despite these testimonies, the jury rejected Patterson's alibi. They convicted him of first-degree murder, concluding he personally fired the fatal shot that killed Y.A. Oliva. His sentence, 50 years to life. Operation Joker's Wild. In the aftermath, law enforcement widened its focus. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, working with the DEA and ATF, began targeting Florencia 13 after a wave of racially motivated attacks on African Americans. By June 2005, detectives were zeroing in on 2 high-ranking figures, Alberto Sugar Hernandez and Manuel Frog Hernandez. Through wiretaps under Operation Joker's Wild, investigators uncovered a disturbing reality. Florencia 13 members weren't just targeting rival gangs. They were driving into black neighborhoods deliberately to launch ambush attacks, carrying out the Mexican mafia's orders to push black residents out. One chilling incident involved Frog spotting 32-year-old Romeo Bryant walking home from work. Frog asked him where he was from. Bryant answered that he wasn't in a gang, but it didn't matter. Frog opened fire in a drive-by, wounding him. Cases like this confirmed Florencia 13's campaign wasn't limited to gang rivals, it was racial, indiscriminate, and sanctioned by higher powers. A violent night in September. The violence continued through the summer. On the night of September 3, 2005, two teenagers, 15-year-old JM and 17-year-old DJ, left a neighborhood store. As they walked, a van rolled past. Inside were three Latino men who locked eyes with the teens. Feeling uneasy, JM and DJ cut through an alley, but the van followed, headlights off. Suddenly, Frank Silva leaned out of the passenger window and opened fire. Another man in the back joined in with a different weapon. DJ was struck in the stomach and collapsed. Silva jumped out of the van, continuing to shoot as he walked toward him. Against all odds, DJ managed to get back up and run, while JM, unarmed, tried to help. A nearby lapped officer heard the gunfire and pursued the van. When it stopped, Silva jumped from the passenger seat with a 9mm pistol. Edward de la Cruz climbed out of the back with a shotgun, and Robert Contreras stepped from the driver's side. All three were arrested on the spot. At the scene, police recovered Silva's loaded 9mm, 3 spent casings that matched his weapon, a spent shotgun shell, and a live birdshot shell that had been cycled through de la Cruz's shotgun. The forensic evidence matched the victim's wounds. DJ required 3 surgeries after a stomach wound, while JM suffered injuries to his head and hand consistent with birdshot spray. The gang war context. The alley where JM and DJ were shot was deep in East Coast Crips territory, plastered with their graffiti. Silva, de la Cruz, and Contreras, however, were tied to Florencia 13. Prosecutors argued the shooting was about more than random violence, it was about building reputation, enforcing control, and sending a warning: stay silent, don't cooperate with police. When Frank Silva took the stand, he admitted that in 2005, he was only 16 and actively repping Florencia 13. That night, he said, he was drinking and smoking with his crew before heading out in his van. Someone handed him a gun, just in case they ran into rivals. He noticed de la Cruz brought a shotgun too. After picking up food from a taco truck in Crip territory, Silva said they spotted 3 young black men throwing up gang signs. Contreras turned the van around, and when they crossed paths again, someone in the van yelled, "Gun." Believing one of the teens was reaching for a weapon, Silva panicked. He grabbed the 9mm from the van floor and fired 3 shots out the window without aiming. Silva denied getting out of the van and insisted he acted out of fear. But the prosecution painted it differently: an organized Florencia 13 hit, part of a larger pattern of racially charged violence. In the end, Frank Silva was convicted of 2 counts of attempted murder. The jury ruled that both shootings were willful, deliberate, and premeditated. His sentence, 40 years to life in prison. But the violence didn't stop there. Less than 2 years later, the streets of Compton were burning again. On January 20, 2007, just after 7:30 p.m., 2 Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies, Stefan Longan and Mark Sinagoa, were on patrol as part of the Compton Homicide Task Force. They were running what's called a saturation patrol, a heavy police presence aimed at suppressing the gang war raging between Florencia 13 and the East Coast Crips near 81st Street and Miramon Avenue. As the deputies rolled south, gunfire erupted. They spotted a man, later identified as Espino, with his arms extended, firing shots west down 81st Street. Longan jumped out of the car and advanced toward him, while Sinagoa flanked from behind. Espino bolted, sprinting south to escape. The deputies gave chase, but then more gunfire cracked from the same direction. This time, it was another shooter, Orozco. He was posted up behind a palm tree, locked in a firing stance. Longan dove behind a parked car for cover as bullets rang out. When he peeked over the hood, Orozco was aiming straight at him with a Glock. They locked eyes. Longan later testified that he never heard bullets whiz past his head, but he believed his life was in imminent danger. He returned fire, striking Orozco, who fell to the ground near the palm tree. Backup arrived quickly. Longan held Orozco at gunpoint while radioing in the situation. Orozco admitted he had been hit in the leg. Next to him, investigators recovered a Glock handgun. Forensics showed the weapon had jammed, 1 round was chambered, another stuck halfway inside, and 3 more live rounds were in the magazine. Had the gun not malfunctioned, Orozco could have continued shooting. Prosecutors charged both Espino and Orozco with assault on a police officer with a semi-automatic firearm. At trial, both were found guilty. With added gang and weapons enhancements, Espino received 29 years and 8 months, while Orozco was sentenced to 42 years and 4 months. But law enforcement wasn't just chasing individual shooters anymore. They were beginning to unravel a much larger picture. Behind the scenes, Operation Joker's Wild was in full swing, a massive, multi-agency crackdown on Florencia 13. This operation went after everything: drug trafficking, extortion, racially motivated attacks, and murders. Agencies from across the board, the DEA, ATF, ICE, IRS, Probation, the LA County Sheriff's Department, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Task Force, joined forces. By 2007, the pressure came to a head. Florencia 13 was hit with federal indictments. Authorities targeted 102 members on charges ranging from narcotics and extortion to murder, attempted murder, and racketeering. It was the largest gang indictment in American history at the time. One name was notably absent: Baldo Barbour Castanos. He was already serving life in Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit. Officials considered bringing him to trial too risky. Even in isolation, Castanos wielded influence, capable of orchestrating orders with just a word. Out of the 104 individuals listed, 97 were eventually arrested. By 2010, 94 had been convicted, either through trials or plea agreements. A handful remained fugitives or had died before facing court. Then, more than a decade later, in 2019, history took an unexpected turn. Baldo Barbour Castanos, an original Florencia 13 member from the 1970s and one of the gang's so-called Three Kings, stepped into a different role. This time, he helped negotiate peace with their long-standing rivals, the East Coast Crips. The idea of peace had been floating for years. As early as 2016, leaders on both sides had quietly discussed the possibility of ending the bloodshed. But it wasn't until Baldo Barbour Castanos of Florencia 13 sat down with Paul "Lil Doc" Wallace from the 69 East Coast Crips that things finally moved forward. After just 3 meetings, the two sides sealed the agreement in September 2019. Remarkably, that truce has held to this day. Since then, Florencia 13 has shifted its focus. Instead of pouring energy into endless gang rivalries, members have been instructed to prioritize money-making operations. Former insiders have revealed that the gang has been running dozens of unlicensed marijuana dispensaries across South Los Angeles. And those shops weren't limited to cannabis; customers could find almost any drug on offer. Beyond drugs, Florencia 13 branched into underground gambling. They operated hidden casinos known as casitas, often tucked inside residential homes or apartments. Inside, patrons could play slot machines, use drugs freely, and even hire sex workers, provided they had the cash. Each casita paid the gang around $300 per week in taxes. The group also tapped into a more traditional form of control: extortion. Local businesses, liquor stores, bars, and small shops were pressured into paying protection money. For $200 to $250 a month, shop owners essentially bought insurance against theft and harassment. Refusing to pay meant running the risk of constant robberies and intimidation. How much of this revenue flowed upward into the Mexican mafia remains unclear. Still, investigators uncovered one telling clue. In a recorded prison call, a Mexican mafia member known as Laredo, locked up since 2000, admitted that roughly 40% of Florencia 13's earnings went directly to just 4 high-ranking shop callers within the mafia.